Hey everyone, welcome back to another art video. I hope you're having a beautiful day so far and thank you so much for joining me today. So in today's video, I thought I'd share my watercolor painting process for a pair of dog eyes, specifically a pair of light colored dog eyes. So last week I worked on this watercolor Labrador portrait to share as real-time full tutorial over on Patreon, which turned out to be a 2.5 hour long tutorial. But I thought that I would share the eye painting process, the step-by-step way that I like doing things when it comes to painting these eyes here on YouTube, because a while back I shared this video in which I provide some key tips to take into account when painting animal eyes. As I'm sharing the tips in that video, I'm also sharing 3 different quick time lapses in which I am painting a pair of owl eyes, a pair of cat eyes, and a pair of dog eyes. Only the dog eyes that I am painting in that video are blue husky eyes. And those are isolated studies, which I've talked about the power of isolated studies before. Honestly, if I hadn't worked on those kinds of isolated studies before setting out to create a full animal portrait, I wouldn't have been so successful. I wouldn't have enjoyed this process as much as I did. Isolated studies really allow us to focus in on one particular feature that we want to develop our skills and knowledge in. And I am a huge proponent for isolated studies, for breaking complex compositions apart into different parts that we can study and learn about in isolation. So I would highly, highly recommend working on that kind of thing. But anyway, after having shared that one video, I've been receiving lots of different questions on painting dog eyes and how I personally move forward painting them and adding them into a portrait. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this video. I am sharing the specific paint colors that I am using during each step, and I'm also letting you know when I have stepped back and I've allowed that previous layer to dry completely before going back in, which is key in painting eyes. All right, and just as an FYI, before moving forward, down below in the description box, you're going to be able to find all of the links to the watercolor painting supplies that you're going to be seeing me use today. In the description box, you're also going to be able to find the link to that previous video that I was talking about before. Make sure you go and check it out if you haven't already, either before or after this video, because it has a ton of very valuable information that you should definitely know about, especially if you're just getting started with painting animal portraits using watercolor. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Usually, I like starting out with base layers all throughout the animal that I'm going to be painting in a very loose way, starting to describe both the variety of values, so lights, midtones, and darks that I'm going to be developing, as well as starting to describe the fur texture or whatever kind of skin texture the animal has before getting started with the actual eyes. I think it's important to acknowledge the structure around the eyes when we're going to be drawing or painting a portrait, whether it's an animal or a human. It's not just about painting in the eyeball, right? It's also about rendering or giving a certain level of realism to the structure around the eye. We have to acknowledge the underlying structure that is there under, the skin and the fur and the color that we're seeing. There's a skull there that is giving form to what we're seeing. And I think that by getting started in this way, I'm just able to start understanding that structure, that brow bone, the overall structure of the dog head and everything like that, so that I have somewhere to jump off from, if that makes any sense. Okay, so in terms of the colors that I am using right now, I am using a combination of raw sienna, burnt sienna, and Van Dyke brown for the actual dog fur. The nose I am painting in with a mixture of carmine with a bit of Van Dyke brown just to tone down that pink a bit. And right about here, I'm gonna go ahead and get started with the very first layer in the eyes that I wanna talk about. And this is a bright yellow layer that I like getting started with, especially when it comes to light dog or similar animal eyes. The bright yellow that I am using right here is transparent yellow medium from my Van Gogh half pan set. And I am going in with a size 6 round brush. Really, I'm just gonna be using 2 different paintbrushes, this size 6 and a size 12 for the larger areas around the eye. And I am painting the entirety of that visible section of that eyeball except for the highlight. It's so important to keep those highlights protected throughout the entire painting process when it comes to painting with watercolor, because once we paint over our paper, there's really no going back to the whiteness and the brightness the paper once had. And those highlights are a huge part behind making a portrait come to life and making those eyes look moist. Okay, so after having worked on this initial bright yellow layer, it's time to take a step back, allow that to dry completely, and in the meantime, I get to work on other areas of the dog. If you're interested in knowing about the colors that I use to paint in those very dark areas in the dog's snout, I used a combination of Van Dyke brown and ultramarine blue. Here at my channel, you're going to be able to find several different step-by-step watercolor painting tutorials that are great for beginners just getting started, in which I explain all about my general method that I use when painting with this medium. I usually like working from light and translucent colors and making my way incrementally towards darker darks in layers, making sure that I am allowing layers to dry in between whenever I need to. And almost always I use a combination of wet on wet techniques with wet on dry techniques. Okay, so after having made some progress throughout the dog and having made sure that I've allowed that first bright yellow layer to dry completely and completely settle into the paper, it's time to get to work on the second layer of paint in those eyes. And for this layer, I'm going to be using burnt sienna. Now, if you notice, I am going in with my burnt sienna in a semi-translucent state. I am not going in super heavy and saturated right away. I am making sure to get into darker values a step at a time. And always throughout this process, I am constantly testing out my color mixtures and the transparencies of my different colors on a scrap piece of watercolor paper before actually going into my painting with them. As I'm painting in the second layer with my burnt sienna, notice how I am working around those highlights that I had already left protected with my first layer, and I'm also leaving extra little sections in which that bright yellow color is able to shine through completely unpainted with the second layer. After having added in that burnt sienna, I removed all of the color from my paintbrush bristles, and I am going back in with a clean and only slightly dampened paintbrush to do a tiny bit of gentle scrubbing and lifting, especially along the lower curve of that eyeball. Notice how by doing that lifting, I am removing a little bit of the burnt sienna and creating soft edges in which that yellow is shining through a little bit. That's exactly what I want. After working on that second layer, it was time to allow everything to dry completely. So once again, I jump on over to working on another section of the dog. In this case, I made a little bit of progress in that nose. And once that second layer of burnt sienna was completely dry, it was now time to get started on the third part of this eye painting process. So we're moving into darker values now, and this color mixture was created by mixing together my Van Dyke brown with my ultramarine blue. So you can see how it looks like a very dark gray. I much prefer creating my own dark color mixtures as opposed to reaching for a ready-made black, such as ivory black, Mars black, lamp black, etc. I talk more about why I like staying away from using ready-made blacks in a past video, which I'll make sure to link to down below. But in any case, you can create a very dark color mixture by mixing together a cobalt blue or ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, or a Van Dyke brown, any dark brown that you have. You just have to shift around your color ratios in your mixture until you arrive at a dark gray. And even with this dark color mixture, I am not going in with this color in its most saturated, darkest state quite yet. This color mixture does contain some water in my color mixing palette, and I am still continuing to test out my color mixtures and their transparencies on my scrap piece of watercolor paper before going into my painting with them, to make sure that I am not right off the bat going in super saturated and super thick. So after having painted in that initial layer of dark gray along the edges of the dog's eye while making sure to stay away from the look of obvious outlines. And that's important because a lot of us feel that instinct to go in and do heavy tracing and create a heavy look of an outline around that eye. And yes, in many cases, that area around the animal's eyes is very dark because their eyelid skin is darker. However, especially when we're going in with a very dark color like this dark gray, and we start mindlessly outlining things and creating stark looking marks, lines, shapes, whatever it is, it starts looking very unnatural. We have to remember that in realism, there are no outlines separating one element from the other element, like we have in cartoons, in which there are outlines around the nose, outlines around the eyes, outlines around pretty much everything, right? And that might be what we initially feel compelled to do, tell apart the nose or the eyes from the rest of the dog's body with a line. But in realism, there are no outlines around the different elements, and we really need to capture that subtlety. So I approach this kind of work in segments, and I am making sure that any marks that I add in to darken those edges around the eye have a wide variation in terms of thicknesses and lights to darks within them. That's going to look a lot more natural. And you can even see a little section below the eye where those little lines don't even connect. So I add those darks around the dog's eye. I did a bit of tracing around the iris, which is a colored part of the eye. I can see very dark values in there in the reference. I added some darks in the tear duct area and that third eyelid area. And then I painted in the actual pupil. Something that's important to know about dog pupils is that a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times what I've seen is that that pupil kind of blurs into and expands into, or at least it seems like it expands into the iris, which is a colored part of the eye, as opposed to with us humans, the edges of our pupil, which is the inner smallest black circle in our eyeballs, those edges are defined for us in our eyes. But in dogs, oftentimes, those edges look like they are blurred out because the pupil is surrounded by a very dark color. And so what I did is, after having painted in that dark pupil, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in with a clean and only slightly dampened paintbrush to run my clean bristles along the edges of that pupil, doing a little bit of merging into the lighter glowing layers of color underneath. Throughout this entire process, I'm constantly looking at my reference photo. Notice if there are any highlights within any of these areas that you want to work around so that white of the paper stands for those highlights. Also notice if there are any visible parts of the sclera, which is the white part of the eye. Sometimes you're going to be able to see part of that sclera when it comes to dog portraits, and you might want to keep certain sections of that sclera protected as highlights. In this particular reference photo that I am using, I can't really see the sclera. It depends on the perspective that you're seeing the dog from and the direction that their eyes are going towards. But I do see some highlights created by the moisture in the dog's tear duct and third eyelid. I also notice some very, very light values along the lower eyelid. So always make sure that you're always acknowledging any lighter values either inside of the eyeball or around the eyeball, and do what you can to work around them or plan for them. And before moving on with the rest of this eye painting process, I just want to take a quick second to welcome all you new people who are just visiting my channel today for the very first time. Welcome, welcome, and I am so happy that you found me. Do consider subscribing because every single week I share a new video with art tips, drawing and painting tutorials, and encouragement and mindset tips for artists. I'd love to have you here and become part of this growing art community. Okay, so after having done some more work throughout the dog's body, further deepening and darkening those darker values and working on describing that fur texture, and also further describing the structure around the eyes, it's now time to get started with what I would consider to be the final part of the eye painting process. And in this part of the process, we're basically darkening the areas around the eye. So again, it's very important to study from references, study from animals that you actually have in front of you in real life so that you can notice what things actually look like and not draw or paint the way you think things look like, because oftentimes these are two very different things. So I'm constantly studying my reference and bringing to mind what I know about dogs from past dogs I've had as pets and other people's dogs I've seen. And almost always around the eye, we have a visible portion of the dog's eyelids. And this color of their eyelid skin changes from dog to dog, but in this particular one, I see that it's quite dark. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be painting in that visible portion of the dark eyelid which merges into the light fur. But at the same time, I am going to be painting that darker portion in with little flicks, little brush strokes that are going to help me describe those little tiny hairs that start growing out in this area that are merging into the light fur. As I am doing all of these flicks, when I am trying to describe the texture of hair, I always make sure to observe my reference and notice both the length of the hair and the direction of the hair growth. And that gives me an indication and clues as to how to create my brush strokes that I am laying down. So once again, this is me staying away from the look of outlines and harsh looking shapes, heavy looking shapes, making sure that I am keeping irregularity, line weight variation when it comes to creating any sort of mark, and just seeing these darker values as tiny little abstract shapes as opposed to any sort of outline. To paint in these areas around the eye, I am using my size 12 round brush. I am using the dark color mixture that we created by mixing together the Van Dyke brown and the ultramarine blue. And I am still, even at this point, making sure that I am taking it a step forward incrementally. I didn't go in with a super saturated color mixture right off the bat because for the most part, this area around the eye is something we're just getting started with. And so I always like making sure that I'm starting with a semi-translucent version of my colors. I continue testing out the translucency of my colors on my scrap piece of watercolor paper and place a little bit of color at a time. If I notice I've placed enough color, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles. I go back in, perhaps do a little tiny bit more flicking, more moving around. If I notice I've placed way too much color too fast, I go in and do some lifting with my absorbent towel. In essence, I create that first layer with this color in a semi-translucent state. And then as that paint is drying, which is happening pretty fast because I'm working wet on dry, I come back to further darken some areas that need darkening, but I allow that previous more translucent layer to shine through. I don't completely go in and cover it up because what I am trying to do here, the objective is to create a wide variety of different values. Okay, and finally, because watercolor always tends to dry a little bit lighter than how it looks when it's wet, I come back after I've allowed everything to dry and assess whether I need to push the darkest darks in some little areas here and there. So I darken those pupils, the centralmost part of those pupils, a little bit more, and just darken some little areas around the eye a tiny bit more, making sure to stay away again from the look of outlines. And that is pretty much it in terms of my process for painting this dog's eyes. I'm going to leave you with the very last part of this painting process, in which I add in the whiskers with white gouache and a fine detailing brush. Alright everyone, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, that you learned something new, or that you found it inspiring. If you did like it, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows more artists to get to know about my channel. Thank you so very much for watching today. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments for me, make sure to leave them down below in the comment section. I always love hearing from you guys and read every single one of your comments. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and stay inspired. Bye guys!